Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, I'm very grateful to my colleague David Cunliffe for taking the first call on this bill due to the fact that I'm attending a dinner in the room next door and unfortunately didn't get the message in time to bring my notes down to the House. So I would normally lead on this on the basis that I did sit on the Select Committee. In fact, I chair the Select Committee that heard the submissions on this bill, and I think that the bill has been improved by its the work that we've done on the Select Committee. But I do actually want to place on record my absolute 100% support for what my colleague David Cunliffe said. And I made our position absolutely clear at the Select Committee, and that is that we want a productivity commission that both governments can support, or that successive governments can support. We actually want that. And we are in a better position to achieve that, but it can be abused. And that will be largely dependent on whether the government of the day, and currently that is the national government, whether they are prepared to use the Productivity Commission that is established by this legislation in the way that it is intended. And I think the Select Committee has given a very good steer about where we want that to, how we want that to occur. But I want to make one preliminary point, and that's this. There were 13 submissions received on this bill. 13. Now, we've just heard the previous speaker say that this was the most important piece of legislation that we've had in front of the House for some time, and overplaying the significance of it. And I'm a huge supporter of the concept of a productivity commission. It's something that I used to muse about when I was the Minister of Commerce, about having a joint Australia and New Zealand Productivity Commission. So impressed was I with Gary Banks, who's been referred to as the chair of the Australian Productivity Commission, and indeed the Commission itself. The work that it does has integrity, it has status, and it has incredible levels of buy-in across the whole of Australia, within its states, across government and across the non-government sector as well. And it has developed a way of consulting that I believe that we could learn from, and I hope is implemented by this. But 13 submissions. I mean, what on earth is going on when only 13 organisations bother to actually put pen to paper to say they either support or reject elements of this? And I was extremely disappointed that Business New Zealand didn't even make an oral submission in support of their submission. In fact, I'd spoken to the committee clerks and said, could you allow half an hour for two of the most important submissions? I'd like half an hour for the Business New Zealand submission so that we can hear from them in detail and really tease out the important things. And we had room to move. With only 13 submissions received, only 7 wanted to be heard. And I said the other half an hour slot I'd like to go to the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, because Business New Zealand and the Council of Trade Unions with the former government had actually been working on productivity in a very unified and collaborative manner. So I felt that that would be a really good way that we could test a number of these issues and really tease out whether there were any differences and what points in commonality there would be, because I actually felt on this issue there would be more in common that there would be opposed. The Business New Zealand didn't even bother making an oral submission in support of their written submission, and I was disappointed with that. The New Zealand Council of Trade Unions did come and presented a very in-depth submission and then provided us with some follow-up material on all the work that they've been doing on the development of productivity. Now, they did focus on one element of productivity, and that was labour market productivity. But the point that they made to the Select Committee was that if you're going to list some elements of productivity, how can you leave that out? Have one thing but not the other. And so that's why we took out the references to the specific elements of productivity that had been included in the previous functions of the Commission. And so the removal of the whole focus on reviewing existing regulatory regimes and agencies, including their efficiency and effectiveness, undertaking regulatory impact analyses of specified regulatory proposals. That's all gone. And the reason that it's gone is that there is no need to limit the way that we view productivity in this way. And the other significant change that we made was to the purpose of the Commission. So the purpose of the Commission originally just read, the principal purpose of the Commission is to provide advice to the government on improving productivity in a way that is directed to supporting the overall well-being of New Zealanders. And we have now added the words having regard to a wide range of communities of interest and population groups in New Zealand society, because unless we take that broader view of productivity, we will be stuck in a very narrow frame, probably one promoted by the former leader of the opposition, as he then was, Dr. Don Brash, who is in fact now leading the productivity, the 2025 task force, where I noticed that his productivity was so good that he spent his entire 3-year salary budget in 1 year. So that's productivity from that field. But I think that the CTU made some extremely good points because they were prepared to walk the talk. They were actively involved with the previous government over the development of productivity. I want to spend a bit of time talking about the hearing of evidence in relation to the Australian Productivity Commission, and I want to place on record our Select Committee's gratitude to Gary Banks for agreeing to travel over from Australia and to present to us. We had 2 meetings with him, one in the public arena, and then he spoke with us privately. But in terms of the private one, it probably added more flesh to the detail rather than the bones, which were clearly stated in the public session. So I want to talk a little bit about what the relationship between the Australian Productivity Commission and the New Zealand Productivity Commission will be. And what Gary Banks made very clear was that his organisation would do what it could for the New Zealand Productivity Commission, once it's created, to cooperate with it and assist it in various ways. And I think that that is an offer that we must accept, because the 2 productivity commissions working collaboratively will in fact strengthen the capacity for the overall productivity lifting on both sides of the Tasman. Now, what I thought was very interesting, because we have been very much of the view that we want to match as far as we can the Australian Productivity Commission. But what Gary Banks gave us at the Select Committee was a summary of where they had come from. They evolved from a long line of institutions going back a long way, and he said indeed going back to 1922 with the Tariff Board, which is where the industry focus came from in their legislation. And then they talked about the modern form of the organisation created under the Whitlam government in 1973, with 2 further incarnations since, with the Industry Commission following the Industries Assistance Commission, and then the Productivity Commission following the Industry Commission. So, and the other thing is that the changes he identified had occurred under both Labor administrations and Liberal National Party administrations in Australia, so the organisation has bipartisan support, although he did say that in its earlier history there was often a little bit of tension that occurred periodically about the organisation given the nature of its role. The last thing that I want to say is the process that they use, and it is simply this. They undertake their first level of submissions on the original report. They then produce a draft report, and then they hear submissions on the draft report. And that is the strength of their organisation, because what it does is it gives the government, and he said this, the government can sit back and watch how the politics play out when the Commission's draft proposals are debated in public. But that is a strength. That is a real strength, because everyone knows what the debate is about at that point, and as a result they have a high degree of credibility, and the result is in the decisions that the successive governments take on the recommendations of the reports. So I'm pleased that as a select committee we were able to make significant changes to the bill, and on that basis we will be supporting its passage.
Call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora koutou.